In the final spring of the Third Reich, when the war in the West was already collapsing into ruin, there were still places in Germany where surrender remained unthinkable. Not because victory was possible. Not because relief was coming. But because, by 1945, obedience, fear, and fanaticism had fused into something harder than strategy. In one of those places, on the main river in Bavaria, an old city of churches, bridges, and stone towers became the stage for a confrontation often reduced to a single dramatic question: what did George Patton say when a German commander refused to surrender his city? The real answer is more revealing than any polished legend. Patton did not need a famous one-liner. He had something far more characteristic: momentum, artillery, and a refusal to waste time on theatrical bargaining. The city was Aschaffenburg. The German commander was Major Emil Lamberth. And what followed was not a witty exchange, but a brutal lesson in what happened when a doomed regime ordered a historic city to fight long after the war around it had already been lost. By late March 1945, Allied armies were driving deep into western Germany. The Rhine had been crossed. American forces were no longer fighting for a beachhead or a border. They were breaking the interior of the Reich open. Patton's Third Army, famous for speed and aggression, was pushing east with the restless force that had become its signature. The broad question was no longer whether Germany would fall, but how much blood would still be spilled before it did. That question mattered in places like Aschaffenburg. The city sat on important roads and crossings east of Frankfurt, where the main river and the surrounding terrain could still be used to slow an advancing army. Militarily, it had value. Symbolically, it had even more. As the front closed in, Nazi authorities increasingly declared towns and cities to be fortresses, to be held at all costs. These orders were less about sound defense than about ideology. Hitler's regime no longer knew how to retreat with dignity, only how to demand sacrifice from others. Aschaffenburg had once been a graceful Franconian city, with the massive Schloss Johannesburg dominating its skyline and centuries of civic life built around narrow streets, churches, and river traffic. By March 1945, that world had been compressed under air raids, shortages, military traffic, and dread. Refugees moved through. Rumors multiplied. The old rhythms of urban life had given way to orders, alarms, and the constant sense that the front was drawing closer by the hour. Into that atmosphere stepped Emil Lamberth, a veteran officer who became the city's combat commander. He was not one of the most famous generals of the war. He did not command armies across continents. But the final phase of the war often turned on men like him, local commanders with shrinking forces and absolute instructions. In many German towns in 1945, such men chose pragmatism. They surrendered before their streets were pulverized. In Aschaffenburg, Lamberth chose the opposite. The reasons were a mixture of military duty, personal conviction, and terror from above. By then, surrender in the wrong atmosphere could bring accusations of cowardice or treason. The Nazi state, even in collapse, still threatened its own servants. In some places, officers or civilians who spoke too openly of capitulation faced summary execution. The regime could no longer guarantee protection from the enemy, but it could still punish hesitation among its own. That was one of its last powers, and it used it savagely. So the city was prepared to resist. German regulars, engineers, Volkssturmmen, scattered personnel, and anti-aircraft units were drawn into a defensive system that was never likely to hold for long against the Americans, but could make entry costly. Barricades were built. Firing positions were organized. Bridges and approaches became contested zones. And beneath the official language of honor and duty lay the real currency of late-war Germany: fear. Fear of the enemy, fear of superiors, fear of being seen as weak at the exact moment when the state had become most irrational. When American forces reached the area on March 25, they were not expecting Aschaffenburg to become one of the nastiest urban fights of the final campaign. Patton's armies were accustomed to hard opposition, but by this point many expected German resistance to crack once armored and infantry pressure arrived. In plenty of places, it did. Here, it did not. The first contact showed quickly that the city would not simply fold. The Americans forced crossings, seized footholds, and tried to exploit weakness. But urban fighting has its own cruel mathematics. A city can turn rubble into defense. Streets channel movement. Cellars, attics, windows, and courtyards become firing points. Even weakened defenders can exact a severe price when they know the ground and have decided not to retreat. The battle for Aschaffenburg became a house-to-house struggle in which every block had to be tested, taken, and often retaken. This was the part of the war that stripped away illusions of clean victory. Infantrymen moved through smoke, broken masonry, and sudden fire from upper stories or hidden corners. Tanks were powerful, but vulnerable in constricted streets. Civilians huddled in basements while artillery cracked overhead and walls shook apart around them. Buildings that had stood for centuries began to burn and collapse in days. The war had already destroyed armies and governments. Now it was destroying memory made of stone. Some versions of the story turned this into a duel of personalities, with Patton confronting a stubborn enemy officer through a sharp message or ultimatum. But the deeper truth is that Patton's style was expressed through action more than conversation. He was not a patient besieger. He was a commander of pressure, speed, and violent persistence. If a defended point blocked the advance, the answer was not to linger in wounded pride. The answer was to break it. That was, in effect, what Patton said. Not a memorable sentence polished for quotation books, but an unmistakable military reply: if the city would not surrender, it would be reduced by force. American artillery was brought to bear. Air power and direct fire added to the punishment. Infantry formations kept pressing. There was frustration inside the American ranks as the resistance continued, because by then many soldiers knew the war was in its last act. Every stubborn pocket of German defense meant more dead men for no strategic outcome that could alter the end. For the civilians of Aschaffenburg, the distinction between military logic and historical tragedy disappeared. The city became both battlefield and victim. Fires spread. Streets vanished beneath debris. Landmarks were shattered. The old castle that had watched over centuries of regional history now presided over devastation. Whatever language commanders used about necessity, the result was plain: one more German city was being consumed because surrender had been delayed past reason. And still the resistance continued. In the final months of the war, this was one of the most revealing characteristics of the Nazi collapse. Germany did not simply fall in a straight line. It convulsed. Some local authorities chose survival. Others clung to fantasies of honor, miracle weapons, or obedience unto death. Sometimes commanders hoped to save themselves politically. Sometimes they feared retribution from the regime more than destruction from the Allies. Sometimes ideology had become so internalized that surrender itself felt like moral extinction. In Aschaffenburg, these impulses combined disastrously. American officers on the ground had to carry the burden that high command titles can obscure. The men advancing through the city were not dealing in abstractions. They were clearing rooms, crossing streets under fire, dragging wounded men from corners filled with dust and sparks. One of the officers central to the fighting was Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who later became known for other grim episodes of the war. At Aschaffenburg, he and his men were facing the maddening persistence of defenders who had every rational reason to stop and yet kept firing. This is where the title of the story becomes most meaningful. What did Patton say to the German commander who refused to surrender his city? In historical memory, people often want the war to produce lines as neat as scenes in a film. They want the clash of wills to condense into 10 unforgettable words. But war is more often made of exhausted decisions than elegant dialogue. Patton's true language here was the language of an army that would not be delayed indefinitely. It said, "Continue the attack. Bring up the guns. Break resistance. Move on." The cost of that language was paid in flesh and masonry. American casualties mounted. German casualties mounted. Civilians paid in terror and homelessness. A city that had survived previous centuries of upheaval was battered into near ruin during days when everyone involved already knew, somewhere beneath the official slogans, that Germany's defeat was inevitable. At last, inevitability forced its way through even here. After days of destruction, with the defenders exhausted and the city shattered, Lambert sought terms. The end came not in heroic finality, but in the dull collapse that marks so many doomed stands. White flags appeared. The commander who had refused surrender yielded after all. The city that had been defended in the name of honor was left wrecked. The regime that had demanded sacrifice would itself vanish within weeks. There was a bitter lesson in that sequence. Lambert had not preserved Aschaffenburg by resisting. He had helped destroy it. The Americans had not been diverted permanently. They had done what their material superiority and operational tempo made almost certain from the beginning. The only variable was how much would be lost before the conclusion everyone already understood became official. For Patton, the episode fit the wider pattern of his advance into Germany. He remains one of the most forceful and controversial American commanders of the war, admired for speed and aggression, criticized for ego and severity, impossible to separate from the personality he projected. But battles like Aschaffenburg reveal something important about Patton beyond legend. His armies were instruments of relentless movement, and when confronted by resistance that served no larger purpose, they answered with concentrated violence. To some, that looked merciless. To others, it was the harsh arithmetic of ending the war as fast as possible. Both views can exist at once. For Germany, Aschaffenburg was one more example of how the regime's final demands fell most heavily on the places it claimed to defend. The rhetoric of total resistance sounded abstract in headquarters and proclamations. In a city, it meant shattered homes, civilians trapped underground, boys and old men drawn into hopeless battle, and cultural inheritance turned into ash. The Nazi promise to protect Germany ended, in case after case, by sacrificing Germany itself. And that is why the question still endures. Not because Patton delivered a line worthy of a screenplay, but because the story exposes a larger truth about the end of the war in Europe. The last battles were not only contests between armies. They were contests between reality and delusion. Between commanders who understood that a war was over and a regime that insisted defeat could still be made meaningful through destruction. Between saving what remained and ruining it for the sake of obedience. In the end, what Patton said to the German commander who refused to surrender his city was spoken less in words than in consequence. He said that refusal would not stop the advance. He said the war would not pause for a dead cause. He said that if a city became a fortress for fanaticism, then war would treat it as one. And when the firing finally ended, the answer stood all around Aschaffenburg in blackened walls, broken streets, and silence. That silence was the final verdict. Not on courage alone, because courage existed on all sides in different forms. Not even on military discipline. But on the terrible emptiness of fighting for a regime that could no longer win, could no longer protect, and could only command others to perish with it. In that sense, the city's surrender came too late to save its stones, and far too late to save the idea for which it had been sacrificed.